The story of the Waffen-SS begins in the early 1930s, during the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. At that time, Adolf Hitler needed a paramilitary force that would be absolutely loyal to him and the ideals of the party. Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's closest and most ambitious allies, took on the task of creating this elite group. What started as a small personal bodyguard unit for Nazi leaders soon evolved into one of the most feared and controversial military forces in history, the Waffen-SS. Himmler had a grand vision for the SS. He aimed to create a force that embraced Nazi ideals of racial purity and loyalty to the regime. Himmler saw the Waffen-SS as a symbol of a new Aryan elite. These soldiers would protect both the nation and the ideology of the Third Reich, showing a strong commitment to Adolf Hitler. In the early years, this dream faced significant challenges. Between 1933 and 1936, the Waffen-SS struggled to function as a military force. They were limited by a lack of resources. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which was Germany's official army, the Waffen-SS had to rely on the Wehrmacht for basic training. Without the proper funding or infrastructure, the SS had to make do with what they had. The men of the SS received standard military drills, but Himmler was not satisfied with that. He wanted to create a force that stood apart from conventional military units in Germany. Himmler wanted to transform these men into something exceptional, soldiers who were strong and skilled in battle. To achieve this, he developed a training program that combined physical endurance with extreme discipline. The physical training was brutal. Soldiers had to bear exhausting exercises designed to test their stamina, strength, and resilience. By 1938, the Waffen-SS had begun to grow in both size and influence. Hitler, initially cautious about the SS, began to trust them more as their training programs advanced. He allowed the SS to conduct large-scale military exercises with live ammunition, which was not typical for most German military units at the time. This move gave the Waffen-SS a huge advantage. They gained real-world experience with their weapons and combat tactics. This change significantly boosted their development as an elite military force. These training exercises marked a turning point. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which followed strict military protocols, the Waffen-SS was trained for flexibility and aggression in combat. They specialized in quick, decisive assaults, taking inspiration from elite forces like the British Commandos and US Army Rangers. Their focus on speed and mobility made them a unique force in the German military, designed to be deployed at the most important points of battle. One of the major factors behind the Waffen-SS's growing influence was the way they evolved into a highly mobile and versatile force. As Germany prepared for expansion and warfare, the ability to strike swiftly and decisively became very important. The Waffen-SS was quick to adopt these tactics, particularly when it came to assault operations and defending major points during battle. This set them apart from the Wehrmacht, whose conventional structure often limited its flexibility. Apart from their evolving combat tactics, the Waffen-SS benefited from increasingly sophisticated weaponry. Early in their development, they were equipped with standard German rifles, machine guns, and other infantry weapons. However, as the Waffen-SS grew in prominence, they were often given priority for cutting-edge equipment. The integration of motorized and mechanized units within the Waffen-SS helped them develop into a force capable of rapid, large-scale movements across battlefields. This became especially valuable in campaigns on the Eastern Front, where mobility was key to success against Soviet forces. Despite the early challenges, the Waffen-SS transformed from a small, under-resourced unit into a highly efficient and elite military force. One of the most important periods for the Waffen-SS came in 1939 with the onset of World War II. By then, they had evolved into a well-organized and effective fighting unit, ready to play a significant role in Hitler's military strategy. Although the Wehrmacht still made up the bulk of Germany's armed forces, the Waffen-SS had established itself as an elite corps within the military, often tasked with special missions and major frontline assignments. During the early years of World War II, the Waffen-SS played major roles in many of Germany's most important military campaigns. They were often used in the most demanding operations, such as leading assaults during the invasion of Poland and later in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Waffen-SS's reputation for aggression and effectiveness in battle solidified their standing within the Nazi regime. Their unique combination of rigorous physical training, operational flexibility, and access to advanced weaponry made the Waffen-SS a formidable force during the war. They were often deployed in areas where the Wehrmacht had struggled, and their ability to carry out rapid and brutal assaults earned them both fear and respect from enemy forces. However, their growing prominence also came with increasing scrutiny, as their aggressive tactics often resulted in higher casualty rates and reports of atrocities on the battlefield. By the end of 1941, the Waffen-SS had firmly established its place within Hitler's military machine. While their story would continue to evolve throughout the course of the war, this period marked the foundation of their military power. Chapter 2: Forging Warriors, the harsh training and indoctrination of the Waffen-SS. The Waffen-SS was known for its fierce loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi cause, as well as for the extreme training that turned ordinary men into skilled soldiers. From the moment they joined, recruits were thrust into a world of physical and mental challenges that would push them to their limits. Heinrich Himmler had a vision of creating an elite force, and to achieve that, he ensured that the Waffen-SS training routine was among the toughest in the world. To become a member of the Waffen-SS, the first hurdle was meeting strict physical standards. Recruits had to be physically fit and healthy, but they also had to match Himmler's vision of an Aryan soldier. This meant they had to be of a certain height, typically over 1.74 meters, and display no physical deformities or weaknesses. The idea was that the soldiers would be strong while also reflecting the Nazi racial ideals. Those who did not fit this mold were often rejected straight away, as the regime aimed to create a force that represented the racially pure future of Germany. Once accepted, recruits were subjected to an intense physical training regimen that was designed to test their endurance, strength, and mental toughness. Training days were long and tiring. Recruits would start with basic exercises like running, weightlifting, and obstacle courses, which were aimed at building their stamina. These activities were about both improving fitness and preparing the soldiers to endure the physical demands of battle. Whether it was marching long distances or carrying heavy equipment, the Waffen-SS needed soldiers who could push through fatigue and discomfort. One of the defining features of the Waffen-SS training was the emphasis on sports. Himmler believed that sports played a major role in shaping the ideal soldier. Boxing, wrestling, track and field, and even rowing were incorporated into the daily routine. While these sports were for physical improvement, they were also meant to build a sense of camaraderie among the men. The shared experience of pushing themselves through pain and exhaustion forged a brotherhood among the recruits, which was very important for building unit cohesion in the heat of battle. But physical training was only part of the equation. Himmler understood that mental resilience was equally important, and the Waffen-SS training included rigorous drills meant to sharpen a soldier's focus and tactical abilities. Recruits were trained in assault tactics, learning how to strike quickly and decisively. Much of this training was inspired by elite military units from other countries, such as the British Commandos and the US Army Rangers, who were known for their effectiveness in special operations. The Waffen-SS studied these units and adapted their tactics, placing a heavy emphasis on mobility, speed, and surprise in combat. The Waffen-SS soldiers were also trained to be flexible and adaptable, prepared to face any situation on the battlefield. Whether it was defending a position or leading an offensive, they were expected to perform at the highest level. Their training with live ammunition and real-world combat scenarios gave them the edge they needed, making them one of the most feared fighting units during World War II. However, the physical and tactical training was only one aspect of the transformation that Waffen-SS recruits underwent. Ideological indoctrination played a major role in shaping their mentality. From the moment they entered training, recruits were bombarded with Nazi propaganda, designed to reinforce their loyalty to Hitler and the principles of the Third Reich. Educational officers, acting much like political commissars in other armies, were tasked with ensuring that every soldier understood and embraced Nazi ideals. These officers used a mix of lectures, reading materials, and speeches to instill a sense of purpose in the soldiers. Loyalty was emphasized above all else: loyalty to Hitler, loyalty to their comrades, and loyalty to the Nazi cause. The training was designed to make soldiers see themselves not just as men fighting for Germany, but as protectors of the Aryan race and the Nazi future. Concepts like courage and sacrifice were distorted to fit the SS's mission, and recruits were made to believe that there was no higher honor than dying for the Führer. Himmler himself played a key role in this ideological training. His vision for the Waffen SS extended far beyond physical prowess. He wanted soldiers who were absolutely loyal to Nazi ideology and who would carry that loyalty into every battle. His influence, along with the Gestapo's oversight, ensured that recruits were constantly reminded of their duty to the regime. By the time a recruit finished his training, he was no longer an ordinary man. He was a soldier molded to be part of an elite fighting force. The mental and physical demands of the training ensured that only the toughest and most loyal men remained. Those who could not keep up were terminated, leaving behind a core group of soldiers who were ready for war. This combination of brutal physical training and intense ideological indoctrination made the Waffen SS a unique force in the German military. While the Wehrmacht emphasized strategy and traditional military values, the Waffen SS focused on creating a new type of soldier, one who was physically strong, tactically skilled, and completely devoted to the Nazi cause. This transformation, overseen by Himmler and the SS leadership, ensured that the Waffen SS would become one of the most feared military units of the war. Chapter 3: Arsenal of Power: The Advanced Weaponry and Technology of the Waffen SS. One of the main factors that made the Waffen SS such a feared and powerful force during World War II was the advanced weaponry and technology they had at their disposal. As an elite unit, they were often given priority access to the latest and most effective weapons, which allowed them to execute their rapid, mobile attacks and defend positions with unmatched firepower. The Waffen SS became known for its use of heavy machine guns, mortars, artillery, and, later in the war, cutting-edge rocket launchers and tanks. These weapons gave them an edge in combat, helping them inflict heavy damage on enemy forces while sustaining the brutal demands of warfare on multiple fronts. Among the most famous and effective weapons used by the Waffen SS was the MG-42 machine gun. Known for its high rate of fire, the MG-42 was a game-changer on the battlefield. It could fire up to 1,500 rounds per minute, making it one of the fastest-firing machine guns of the war. This allowed the Waffen SS to mow down advancing infantry with ease, turning even small defensive positions into deadly strongholds. The gun's reliability and ease of operation made it a favorite among SS troops, who quickly learned to maximize its effectiveness in both offensive and defensive operations. The MG-42's versatility allowed it to be mounted on vehicles used in fixed positions or carried by infantry, making it a very important tool in the SS's arsenal. The effectiveness of the MG-42 was especially evident during defensive operations, where well-placed machine guns could hold off entire enemy battalions. One notable example of this was during the battle at the Oder River in June 1944. A small Waffen SS unit armed with MG-42s managed to stop an entire British battalion's advance. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the SS soldiers held their ground, pinning down the British forces and inflicting heavy casualties. The MG-42's firepower and the strategic positioning of the machine gun nests allowed the Waffen SS to delay the enemy for hours, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Apart from machine guns, the Waffen SS also made extensive use of mortars, which were important in both offensive and defensive operations. Mortars were relatively easy to transport and set up, which allowed the SAS to provide immediate fire support without needing large artillery units. During defensive operations, mortars were often pre-positioned to target key areas of the battlefield. This allowed the SS to shell advancing enemy forces even as they pulled back to more secure positions. In some cases, they would intentionally give up ground, only to attack the enemy with mortar fire once they had advanced into the kill zone. A famous example of the SS's use of mortars was during the battle at KP Airfield in July 1944. The Waffen SS had carefully pre-registered their mortar fire, allowing them to unleash a destructive barrage as Canadian forces advanced. The well-coordinated use of mortars completely disrupted the Canadian attack, causing confusion and chaos among their ranks. The heavy mortar fire played a major role in delaying the enemy advance, ultimately allowing the SS defenders to hold the airfield despite being outnumbered. The Waffen SS's ability to use heavy weaponry effectively was further enhanced by their access to advanced technology and experimental weapons. By 1938, Adolf Hitler had granted the SS permission to conduct live ammunition exercises and large-scale military maneuvers. This gave the Waffen SS invaluable experience in handling their weapons in real-world combat scenarios, allowing them to perfect their tactics and strategy. These exercises often involved artillery and live-fire drills, providing SS soldiers with the confidence and skill needed to execute complex operations under battlefield conditions. One of the more innovative technologies employed by the Waffen SS was the introduction of multi-barreled rocket launchers, such as the 8-centimeter Raketenwerfer. These rocket launchers were capable of firing multiple rockets in rapid succession, providing the SS with an overwhelming volume of fire in a short period. The 8-centimeter Raketenwerfer, in particular, became a favorite weapon for the SS due to its mobility and firepower. It was first deployed in early 1943 during the fighting on the Eastern Front, where it was used to great effect in countering Soviet tank advances and infantry assaults. The SS had a distinct advantage when it came to experimental weapons, as they were often given access to prototypes before other units. This included heavy artillery pieces, advanced tanks like the Panther, and specialized rocket systems. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, became one of the most formidable weapons in the SS arsenal. With its thick armor and powerful 75mm gun, the Panther was capable of taking on the Soviet T-34s and other Allied tanks. SS units were often the first to receive these tanks, giving them an edge in armored combat. One of the most famous engagements involving SS Panther tanks was during the Battle of Normandy in 1944. SS tank commanders, armed with these advanced machines, played an important role in defending against the Allied invasion. Their superior firepower and mobility allowed them to hold key positions and delay the Allied advance, even as the rest of the German front began to collapse. The Panther's ability to withstand direct hits from Allied tanks and artillery gave the SS a significant advantage in the fighting. The Waffen SS also used a wide range of artillery pieces, including heavy guns captured from other countries. Many of the mortars and artillery pieces used by the SS were originally French, Polish, or Soviet, which had been captured during earlier campaigns. These captured weapons were put to good use, often serving in SS units that operated in rear guard or defensive roles. The ability to repurpose captured enemy weapons gave the Waffen SS additional firepower when needed, especially as the war dragged on and German industry struggled to keep up with demand. One of the most interesting aspects of the Waffen SS's approach to combat was their willingness to innovate and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. They were not bound by the traditional military doctrines that governed the Wehrmacht. Instead, they were encouraged to experiment with new tactics and technologies, which often gave them an edge in combat. This approach was especially effective during the German-Soviet confrontations on the Eastern Front, where the SS's use of heavy artillery and armored vehicles allowed them to hold back the numerically superior Soviet forces. As the war progressed, the Waffen SS continued to push the boundaries of military technology. They developed modified rocket systems, advanced tanks, and even new types of anti-tank weapons to deal with the growing threat of Allied armored divisions. Their access to experimental weapons and cutting-edge technology gave them a distinct advantage in combat, allowing them to remain a powerful force even as Germany's overall military situation worsened. Chapter 4: Foreign Legions of the Waffen SS, the multinational force of the Third Reich. The Waffen SS soon became a melting pot of nationalities from across Europe during World War II. Although the SS was founded on the principles of Aryan superiority, the demands of war, especially after 1941, forced the inclusion of volunteers from countries that had fallen under Nazi control or influence. This was not a tactical move. It was a necessity as Germany struggled with manpower shortages and had to expand its fighting forces. By the end of the war, around 40% of the Waffen SS was made up of non-German volunteers, with recruits coming from places like France, Spain, Ukraine, Croatia, and other nations. The recruitment of foreign volunteers began relatively early, though it did not become widespread until the pressures of war increased. Nazi propaganda played a major role in attracting volunteers, framing the conflict as a broader European struggle against Bolshevism. Many of these recruits were drawn to the fight by the belief that communism was a threat to their countries, and they saw the Waffen SS as the best way to combat it. Others joined due to economic hardship, a sense of adventure, or because they sympathized with Nazi ideology. The recruitment process for these foreign volunteers varied depending on the country. In some places, like the Baltic states, volunteers were drawn from nationalist movements that opposed Soviet control. In others, such as France, collaborationist governments helped recruit men to fight alongside the Germans. Often these volunteers were promised rewards, such as political influence or autonomy for their countries, though few of these promises were fulfilled. Despite initial hesitation from Hitler, who was reluctant to allow non-Germans into what he envisioned as an Aryan elite, Himmler was able to convince him that foreign recruits were essential to continuing the war effort. A well-known foreign unit was the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen, formed primarily from ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, living in the Balkans. The division saw heavy combat in anti-partisan operations in the region and became popular for its brutal tactics. Although many of its recruits were of German origins, they still faced challenges in terms of integration, as they lacked the rigorous training and ideological indoctrination of their German counterparts. The same could be said for many other foreign divisions, where discipline and effectiveness often lagged behind that of the original Waffen SS units. Several other foreign divisions were formed, such as the 13th SS Handschar Division, made up of Bosnian Muslims, and the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, which included volunteers from Scandinavia and other Northern European countries. These divisions were unique, composed of men from various backgrounds, many motivated by nationalism, anti-communism, or a desire to protect their homelands from Soviet control. The Nazis saw this as an opportunity to unite Europe under the Third Reich, using these men to further their goals. However, integrating foreign volunteers into the Waffen-SS was not without challenges. German officers often viewed these recruits with suspicion, doubting their loyalty and combat effectiveness. The ideological indoctrination that was so central to the training of German SS divisions was not as thoroughly applied to foreign recruits. While they were taught Nazi ideals and encouraged to see themselves as part of a broader European mission, the connection to Nazi ideology was weaker for many foreign volunteers. This sometimes created tensions within the ranks, as German SS soldiers viewed themselves as superior to their foreign comrades. Training for these foreign volunteers differed significantly from that of German recruits. German SS divisions went through intense physical and ideological training, designed to mold them into loyal, fanatical soldiers. Foreign recruits, however, were often rushed through training camps, receiving just enough military instruction to make them combat-ready. As a result, foreign divisions were generally less effective in battle, suffering higher casualty rates and struggling to match the discipline and skill of their German counterparts. This was especially evident in units that were hastily formed as the war turned against Germany, with some foreign divisions being sent into battle with little more than basic training. However, the successes of these foreign divisions were often overshadowed by their shortcomings. Many foreign volunteers lacked the motivation and loyalty that defined the German SS divisions. In some cases, foreign divisions were used primarily for rearguard duties or anti-partisan operations, rather than being deployed to the front lines. By the final years of the war, as the Waffen-SS expanded rapidly, many of the new foreign units were filled with conscripts who had little desire to fight for Nazi Germany. The quality of these units diminished, and their role in the war became increasingly marginal. While foreign volunteers helped the Waffen-SS maintain its strength as the war dragged on, they also highlighted the contradictions within Nazi ideology. Hitler's regime, built on the idea of racial purity, had to rely on soldiers from countries it deemed inferior. In the end, even the Nazis had to compromise their ideology when the reality of war set in. Despite the contributions of these foreign recruits, the Waffen-SS remained at its core a German institution, with foreign volunteers often treated as second-class soldiers. As the war drew to a close, the Waffen-SS's reliance on foreign volunteers became more desperate, but it was clear that the original vision of an Aryan elite had given way to the harsh realities of war. Chapter 5. Masters of the battlefield, the specialized divisions of the Waffen SS. The Waffen SS, in its rise to military prominence, became known for its specialized divisions, which played major roles in key battles throughout World War II. These divisions were designed to be more than standard infantry units. They were built to act as shock troops, equipped with superior weaponry and subjected to advanced training. Among the most famous of these specialized divisions were the Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units, which stood out for their mechanized and armored capabilities, allowing the SS to conduct fast and decisive operations on the battlefield. One of the most elite units within the Waffen SS was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Originally formed as a bodyguard unit for Adolf Hitler, it evolved into one of the most feared divisions in the German military. Equipped with state-of-the-art tanks, including the powerful Panther and Tiger models, this division became known for its aggressive tactics and its ability to hold key positions under the most intense combat conditions. The Leibstandarte was heavily involved in some of the largest and most brutal battles of the war, including Operation Barbarossa, the Battle of Kursk, and the defense of Normandy. Another unit that gained popularity for its combat effectiveness was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This division was unique as it was composed largely of young men from the Hitler Youth, many of them just 17 or 18 years old. Despite their inexperience, these soldiers fought with devotion and determination, earning a reputation for their toughness in battle. The Hitlerjugend division was heavily involved in the Normandy campaign, where it was tasked with holding the line against the Allied invasion. Despite suffering massive casualties, including losing nearly 60% of its original force, the division managed to delay the Allied advance, showing both its resilience and the tactical importance of SS Panzer divisions. What set these specialized divisions apart from standard infantry was their heavy use of tanks and mechanized vehicles, as well as the intense training that focused on speed, mobility, and coordinated attacks. Panzer divisions in particular were trained to execute combined arms operations, where infantry, artillery, and armored units worked closely together to overwhelm enemy defenses. This made them incredibly effective in offensive operations, where the goal was to break through enemy lines quickly and create chaos behind the front. Their focus on rapid movement and aggressive attacks was inspired by the blitzkrieg tactics that had brought Germany early success in the war. In contrast to standard infantry divisions, which often relied on foot soldiers and basic support weapons, the Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions of the Waffen SS were equipped with some of the most advanced weaponry of the time. Alongside their Panther and Tiger tanks, these divisions used heavy artillery, mortars and machine guns like the MG-42 to devastating effect. Their access to better equipment, combined with more extensive training, gave them a major edge over both Allied and Soviet forces in the early years of the war. The role of these specialized divisions became even more important as the war dragged on, particularly in defensive operations. By 1943, as Germany's fortunes on the Eastern Front began to wane, the Waffen SS was often called upon to act as a fire brigade, sent to reinforce crumbling defenses or launch counterattacks when other units were overwhelmed. This was especially evident during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, where several SS Panzer divisions, including Leibstandarte and Das Reich, were positioned at the center of the German assault. Although the offensive ultimately failed, the SS units proved their tactical value by launching repeated attacks against heavily fortified Soviet positions. The Ardennes offensive, more famously known as the Battle of the Bulge, was another moment where specialized Waffen SS divisions played a major role. In this last-ditch German counteroffensive in late 1944, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend were at the forefront of the assault. The goal was to push through the Ardennes forest and recapture the strategic port of Antwerp, creating a wedge between the Allied forces. Although initially successful, the offensive ultimately failed due to the Allies' superior air power and logistical support. Still, the SS Panzer divisions managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Allies and slowed their advance for weeks. Despite their great military prowess, these specialized divisions were not without major flaws. As the war progressed, even these elite units began to suffer from shortages of supplies and manpower. By 1944, many panzer divisions were operating with fewer tanks than they had at the start of the war, and the quality of new recruits, often hastily conscripted and poorly trained, could not match that of the original soldiers. For example, by the time the Leibstandarte division fought in the defense of Berlin in 1945, it was a shell of its former self, with only a fraction of its original strength and most of its tanks destroyed or out of commission. The tactics used by these specialized divisions also became less effective as the war went on. While their ability to conduct rapid and powerful offensives had proven decisive in the early years of the war, by 1944 the Allied and Soviet forces had adapted, using air superiority and improved anti-tank weapons to counter the German armored threat. The once dominant panzer divisions found themselves increasingly vulnerable, as the speed and mobility that had been their greatest strengths were no longer enough to overcome the sheer weight of Allied and Soviet numbers. The use of these divisions as fire brigades also came at a cost. Constantly being moved from one front to another with little time to rest or refit meant that even the most elite SS units became worn down by attrition. The Hitlerjugend division, which had fought so fiercely in Normandy, was nearly wiped out by the time of the Ardennes offensive, and many of its soldiers were too young and inexperienced to withstand the harsh conditions of the war's final months. Despite these challenges, the specialized divisions of the Waffen SS left a lasting mark on the battlefield. Their innovations in armored warfare and combined arms tactics have been studied by military historians for decades, and their legacy continues to influence modern military doctrine. However, their effectiveness on the battlefield cannot be separated from the brutal ideology that drove them. Many of these divisions, including the Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend, were directly involved in war crimes, including the massacre of civilians and the execution of prisoners of war. Their reputation as elite soldiers is thus inseparable from the atrocities they committed in the name of the Nazi regime. The specialized divisions of the Waffen SS were the sharp edge of Germany's war machine, designed for speed, aggression, and total victory. However, as the war progressed and the tide turned against Germany, even these divisions could not stop the growing momentum of the Allied and Soviet advances. What began as an experiment in military superiority ended in defeat and disgrace, as the SS divisions were ground down by the realities of total war. Chapter 6. The Long Fall. The Decline of the Waffen SS. After 1943. By 1943, the Waffen SS had reached its peak as a feared and highly trained military force. However, the war's shifting tides, combined with severe losses and overexpansion, led to a rapid decline in both its effectiveness and prestige. The pivotal moment in this downturn came with the defeat at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, a disaster that shattered the once elite units of the Waffen SS. This defeat marked the beginning of a period of continuous decline for the Waffen SS as they faced heavy casualties, inexperienced recruits, and a crumbling war effort. The Battle of Kursk was a massive tank battle, involving nearly 3,000 German tanks against over 5,000 Soviet tanks. The Germans, including the Waffen SS's best divisions like the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, suffered around 200,000 casualties during this failed offensive. The SS divisions alone lost thousands of men and a significant portion of their armored vehicles. For example, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division lost over 1,500 men and nearly 70 tanks in this battle. These losses were devastating and left the divisions severely weakened. Kursk marked the point at which the Waffen SS could no longer maintain its reputation as an elite, invincible force. After Kursk, the Waffen SS began to lose its grip on the qualities that had once made it a feared military unit. One of the main reasons was the rapid expansion of its ranks. By 1944, the Waffen SS had grown from just a few divisions to over 38 divisions, with roughly 950,000 men serving by the end of the war. However, this expansion came at a cost. Many of these new divisions were filled with conscripts and foreign volunteers who did not receive the same rigorous training as the original SS units. Instead of the carefully selected and ideologically indoctrinated soldiers that had once filled the ranks, the Waffen SS now relied on less experienced men, often rushed into service with minimal training. the quality of recruits began to decline dramatically. In 1943, nearly half of the new Waffen SS divisions were composed of foreign volunteers from countries such as France, Hungary, and the Baltics. By 1944, over 60% of the Waffen SS consisted of non-German soldiers, many of whom were conscripted under strain. These new divisions lacked the combat effectiveness and discipline that had once set the Waffen SS apart. For example, the 21st SS Division Skanderbeg, composed of Albanian recruits, was disbanded in 1944 due to poor performance and desertion rates as high as 70%. One of the Waffen SS's most critical weaknesses after 1943 was its inability to replenish its elite divisions. As the war dragged on, the SS divisions that had once led the charge in offensive operations were now reduced to defensive roles, often fighting with depleted ranks and outdated equipment. For instance, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, which had originally been equipped with 150 tanks during the Normandy invasion, had fewer than 25 operational tanks by the end of the wartime of the German retreat in 1945. Their manpower losses were even more staggering, with some units reduced to less than 50% of their original strength after only a few months of combat. By 1944, the Waffen SS was facing both manpower shortages and a severe lack of supplies and modern equipment. The Soviet offensives of Operation Bagration in June 1944 inflicted further catastrophic losses on the SS divisions. Over the course of a few weeks, the Soviets destroyed entire German army groups, including many Waffen SS units. The 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, lost over 60% of its men and vehicles during these operations. The inability to replace lost tanks, artillery, and even basic infantry weapons left the Waffen SS struggling to maintain its operational capabilities. By late 1944, many SS units were fighting with outdated equipment or without the heavy armor support that had been a key factor in their earlier successes. The situation only worsened as the war dragged into 1945. The Waffen SS's elite divisions were repeatedly sent to the most important points of the battlefield, often with orders to hold positions at all costs. The defense of Hungary in 1944 to 1945 was a prime example of this desperation. During Operation Spring Awakening, the last major German offensive of the war, Waffen SS divisions such as the 6th SS Panzer Army were tasked with leading the attack. Despite their best efforts, the offensive failed within weeks, with the Waffen SS suffering over 20,000 casualties in the process. Many of the SS divisions were reduced to a fraction of their original size, with some units losing over 70% of their manpower during the campaign. The defense of Berlin in 1945 marked the final act for the Waffen SS. As the Soviets closed in on the German capital, the remnants of the Waffen SS were tasked with defending the city. Units such as the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland and the remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler were among the last to fight in the streets of Berlin. The defense of Berlin cost the Waffen SS thousands of lives, with entire divisions wiped out in the final days of the war. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Waffen SS had been all but destroyed. Out of the nearly 1 million men who had served in the Waffen SS, an estimated 314,000 had been killed, with hundreds of thousands more wounded or captured. The elite divisions that had once led Nazi Germany's military campaigns were now shadows of their former selves, shattered by years of relentless combat and a lack of experienced recruits. The decline of the Waffen SS reflected the overall collapse of Nazi Germany. After 1943, the downfall of the Waffen SS became certain as it was worn down by the pressures of total war. Chapter 7. Dark Shadows of the Elite, War Crimes and the Complicated Legacy of the Waffen SS. While the Waffen SS is remembered for its role as an elite fighting force, it is also known for the war crimes that follow its legacy. The atrocities committed by the SS were not random acts of violence, but part of a broader campaign that reflected the twisted ideology at its core. While they gained a reputation for their battlefield effectiveness, their involvement in mass killings, particularly on the Eastern Front and in occupied territories, forever stained their image. The brutality of the Waffen SS was rooted in the ideological indoctrination that all SS soldiers underwent during their training. From the beginning, they were taught that they were warriors for the Nazi cause, fighting for the survival of the Aryan race. This idea fueled their actions and justified extreme violence, especially against those considered inferior by the Nazi regime. On the Eastern Front, this led to the execution of Soviet political commissars and the extermination of civilian populations, all in the name of the Reich. One of the most renowned directives given to the Waffen-SS was the Commissar Order, which came directly from Adolf Hitler in 1941. This order mandated the execution of all Soviet political commissars captured during the invasion of the Soviet Union. These commissars were political officers within the Red Army who were responsible for maintaining the ideological purity of Soviet forces. Nazi leadership viewed them as representatives of Bolshevism, which they saw as their mortal enemy. SS soldiers were told that by killing these commissars, they were protecting Germany from the spread of communism. This policy led to countless summary executions on the battlefield, with no regard for the basic rules of war. But the crimes of the Waffen-SS went far beyond the battlefield. They played an active role in the Holocaust, working alongside the Einsatzgruppen, which were mobile killing squads responsible for mass shootings of Jews, Romani, and other minority groups in Eastern Europe. While not all Waffen-SS units were directly involved in these killings, many were complicit. They helped round up civilians, guarded transport trains bound for concentration camps, and even participated in mass shootings. The ideological brainwashing that these soldiers had undergone made it easier for them to carry out such horrific tasks. They were taught to see their victims as subhuman, making it easier to rationalize the violence they inflicted. One of the most shocking examples of SS brutality came in the small French village of Oradour-sur-Glane in June 1944. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich entered the village as part of a reprisal against the French resistance. What followed was an unimaginable massacre. SS soldiers rounded up the entire population, including men, women and children, into the village church and several barns. They then set the buildings on fire and shot anyone who tried to escape. In the span of just a few hours, 642 civilians were brutally killed. This act was part of the Waffen-SS's broader strategy of collective punishment, where entire communities were made to suffer for the actions of a few resistance fighters. Similar scenes of destruction played out on the Eastern Front, where SS units were tasked with anti-partisan operations. In reality, these missions often resulted in mass murder. In Belarus, for example, entire villages were wiped out as part of these operations. Civilians, including women and children, were executed on the spot or burned alive in their homes. The SS operated under the belief that these extreme measures were necessary to suppress resistance and secure Nazi control over occupied territories. In reality, they only deepened the hatred for the SS and resulted in further resistance. The Waffen-SS's participation in these crimes was deeply tied to the Nazi obsession with racial purity. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, often spoke about the need to cleanse the lands conquered by Germany. For the SS, this meant the removal, often through mass murder, of anyone who did not fit their vision of an Aryan utopia. The Waffen-SS soldiers were expected to carry out this mission without question. They were conditioned to believe that their actions, no matter how brutal, were necessary to secure the future of the Reich. While the atrocities committed by the SS on the Eastern Front and in occupied territories are well documented, their crimes extended across Europe. In Italy, SS units were responsible for the massacre of more than 500 civilians in the village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema in August 1944. Like so many previous massacres, this one was carried out in retaliation for political crimes. The SS, in their drive to crush resistance, often took a scorched earth approach, destroying villages and killing civilians to terrorize the population into submission. The war crimes of the Waffen-SS did not stop with the killing of civilians. They were also known for their treatment of prisoners of war, particularly on the Eastern Front. Soviet prisoners, in particular, were often treated with extreme cruelty, subjected to starvation, forced labor, and execution. The SS viewed Soviet soldiers as ideological enemies and thus unworthy of the basic rights afforded to prisoners under international law. In some instances, entire groups of prisoners were executed, particularly in the early years of the war. Chapter 8. From Soldiers to Survivors, the Post-War Fate of Waffen SS Veterans. The end of World War II in 1945 left thousands of Waffen SS soldiers facing an uncertain future. As the Nazi regime collapsed, these men, once part of one of the most feared military forces, had to navigate a post-war world that viewed them as criminals. Their experiences after the war varied. Some were prosecuted for war crimes, while others tried to reintegrate into society and move on with their lives. The legacy of the Waffen SS followed them wherever they went, shaping how they were treated and remembered in the decades that followed. For high-ranking Waffen SS officers, the aftermath of the war was often very uncertain. Many were brought to trial in the famous Nuremberg trials and other war crimes tribunals. Leaders like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, were held responsible for the atrocities committed by their forces, though Himmler took his own life before he could face justice. Others, like Joachim Peiper, faced trial for their involvement in massacres and the use of forced labor. The Nuremberg trials condemned the entire SS, including the Waffen SS, as a criminal organization, linking all of its members to the war crimes committed during the Nazi era. For these senior officers, sentences ranged from death by hanging to life imprisonment. War crimes trials continued even after Nuremberg, with many officers who had participated in atrocities like the Holocaust being hunted down and brought to justice. Some escaped, slipping through the cracks, but the pursuit of those responsible for SS war crimes lasted for decades. The process was not always fast or fair, but it ensured that those at the top were held accountable for the unimaginable horrors of the war. However, the fate of lower-ranking Waffen SS veterans was different. Many were captured by the Allies and sent to POW camps, where they were often held alongside regular Wehrmacht soldiers. Life in these camps could be tough, with overcrowding and food shortages, but many Waffen SS men were eventually released and allowed to return home. While their leaders faced prosecution, the rank-and-file soldiers mostly avoided war crime trials. This was partly because it was difficult to prove individual responsibility for war crimes unless they had been directly involved in events like the massacres on the Eastern Front. Returning to civilian life was not easy, though. In post-war Germany, being associated with the Waffen-SS carried a heavy stigma. The organization's role in the war was well known, and many former SS men had to hide their past or change their names to avoid discrimination. For those who were open about their service, finding jobs or even acceptance in their communities was difficult. The Waffen-SS was closely tied to the Nazi regime's most extreme policies, and even those who had not directly committed war crimes were still seen as outcasts by their association with the group. The situation was even worse for foreign volunteers who had fought in the Waffen-SS. Countries like Ukraine, Croatia, and Latvia, where many of these volunteers came from, were now under Soviet control. In these regions, former SS members were often treated as traitors and enemies of the state. Thousands of foreign SS soldiers were executed or imprisoned by Soviet authorities, who had no interest in distinguishing between regular soldiers and war criminals. For many of these men, the war did not end in 1945. They spent years, even decades, in Soviet labor camps as punishment for their collaboration with Nazi Germany. In Western Europe, foreign Waffen-SS veterans faced legal action as well. Volunteers from countries like France and Belgium were seen as collaborators, and many were imprisoned for fighting alongside the Nazis. Unlike in the Soviet-controlled East, however, these former SS men were often released after serving their sentences, though they still carried the stigma of having fought for the enemy. Public opinion in countries that had been occupied by Germany was unforgiving, and many foreign Waffen-SS veterans lived out their lives in anonymity, receiving a cold shoulder from their fellow countrymen. One of the most difficult challenges for Waffen-SS veterans was dealing with the public perception of their service. The SS, including the Waffen-SS, had been declared a criminal organization, and even those who had fought solely as soldiers without direct involvement in atrocities were affected by that label. In Germany, the new post-war government distanced itself from anything related to the Nazi regime, and former SS men found themselves left out in the cold. The once celebrated elite of the Third Reich had become a symbol of its darkest chapters, and this made reintegration into society difficult, if not impossible, for many. For some Waffen-SS veterans, particularly those who had held leadership positions, there was no chance of reintegrating. High-profile figures either fled to countries like Argentina, where they could live in relative anonymity, or continued to face prosecution years after the war had ended. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and other organizations dedicated to tracking down war criminals made it their mission to bring SS members to justice, and many former officers lived in fear of being caught, even decades after the war. Some were found and put on trial, while others managed to escape justice entirely. While some military historians have tried to focus on the Waffen SS's battlefield successes and tactics, their role in the atrocities of the Third Reich cannot be ignored. The military skill of the Waffen SS may be of interest to those studying the history of warfare, but the moral failures of the organization are what ultimately define its place in history. In the years since the war, there have been efforts to memorialize the victims of the Waffen SS's crimes. In places like Oradour-sur-Glane in France, where SS units massacred entire villages, memorials stand as a symbol of the horrors that were inflicted during the war. Whether they were high-ranking officers facing trial for war crimes or lower-ranking soldiers trying to hide their service, the shadow of the SS followed them for the rest of their lives. The legacy of the Waffen SS is one of bloodshed, violence, and fanaticism, and the fate of its veterans shows the moral and ethical questions raised by their service to the Nazi regime.